I think that what happened by the time Jesus arrived is He's dealing with the nation of Israel, who has set for over 1,000 years. If you stretch back to the dawn of the Mosaic covenant. And by Mosaic, I mean that time Moses walks up the mountain of Sinai and God writes 10 commandments on 2 sapphire tables of stone, hands it off to Moses. He comes back down the mountain, begins to write what the Jews call the Torah, what we call the Pentateuch. And that codicil of books between Genesis and Deuteronomy that encompass the law of God, dietary law, sexual law, purity law, cleanliness law, territorial law. All of these things that Israel was supposed to do, but the covenant was a covenant of performance. There's no way around it. If you do good, take care of the widow and the stranger in your land, I'll bless you. If you don't do good and you don't take care of the widow and the stranger in your land, I'm going to kick you out of the land. And that roller coaster happens through the Old Testament over and over again. Here's Israel not in Canaan, wandering around the wilderness. And they obey the covenant. They cross the Jordan. They get the land of Canaan. Here's Israel putting up strange gods in the land and abandoning the widows and the fatherless. And so God has an enemy come in, take the land from them. Here's Israel getting to come back, rebuild their temple. What happens? They get home, they abandon the widow and the fatherless. They forget the stranger. They stop being their brother's keeper. Somebody takes the land from them again. That roller coaster goes over and over and over again. Why? Well, we've said for a long time it's because, well, they had the law, and the law incites sin, and I believe that's very true. I think the law does incite sin. You want a sin revival in people, preach the 10 Commandments. The Apostle Paul said, I was okay, then the sin came, the commandment came, sin revived, I died. Did you hear that? I was alive, the commandment came, sin revived, I died. You want to watch people fail? Tell them not to. That's how people fail every time. Put do not enter on a door and everybody will enter the door. They didn't even care what was behind the door. Then you stuck a stupid sign on the door. Then everybody can't sleep at night because they want to know what's behind the do not enter sign. That's what happens under the law. You give people instruction. People go crazy because they feel like I must be missing out on something. They didn't want me to do that. Must be really good. That's part of what happens when the law enters. But another thing that happens in Israel is the reason why Israel rides that roller coaster all the way up to the time of Christ is because I don't believe you can ever really have peace when you're birthed in slavery. And so when you're birthed under submission and you're birthed under obedience and you're birthed under someone's thumb, you can never really be at peace. Even when they pick their thumb up off of you, you always are fearful that you deserve to be under the thumb. So people born in a slave mentality, even when they're released, walk out of slavery still thinking like a slave. And so even their food diet, even their mentality, even the way they treat their neighbor, it's like being back in the prison yard. It's the only way they know how to govern their life is because they spent so much time underneath someone else's thumb. The issue that Jesus encounters with the nation of Israel is that because of the Sinai covenant, they come out of or not because of the Sinai covenant, what leads to the Sinai covenant is coming out of Egypt. What was happening in Egypt? Israel are slaves. And although they come into Egypt as sons of Abraham, they go out of Egypt as 4 centuries of slavery. 10 generations have lived underneath slavery in the land of Egypt. There's not a soul that comes out of Egypt that remembers what it was like to go into Egypt. Everyone that comes out has the mentality of a person born into slavery. Their grandfather was born into slavery. Their father was born into slavery. They know their kids are born into slavery. There's no hope. And that slave mentality chases Israel into the wilderness. And the slave mentality causes a servant mentality where they begin to look at God not as a father but as a master. And most of the literature of the Old Testament is treating God as a tyrannical master rather than as a loving father. The reason why Israel, the Pharisees, the Sadducees, the high priest, and the leadership of Israel miss Jesus when He arrives is He doesn't portray the picture of a tyrannical master. He portrays the picture of a loving father. And that's confusing to Israel because God's not a loving father, at least not the way they see Him. And because they're wrong about who their father is, they miss their father when He puts on an earth suit and walks in front of them. Jesus puts on an earth suit and walks in front of them and He says, I and my Father are one. I have the glory I had with my Father from the beginning. That glory I share with you. You see, just show us the Father, they say. Jesus says, how long do I need to be here before you realize if you see me, you've seen the Father? The answer to that is He could still be here and we'd be missing it because they had a wrong picture of what the Father actually looked like. And so the mentality is that God is my master and I am a slave. And because I'm a slave, I'm a servant. And if I'm a servant, I got to do what He says. If I don't do what He says, hey, then I'm not going to be a part of who He is. And because of that, there's a distance and a chasm that's been built between Israel and God. I say tonight that chasm still exists in the world. Because for so many of us, God's still a master and we're still a servant. And we say things like, I just want to serve the Lord. I just want to get home and hear Him say, well done, good and faithful servant. But how many of you realize well done, good and faithful servant is a parable that Jesus told to Israel? It's not a story He told to the new covenant. Wow. Hebrews chapter 2 says Jesus came to bring many sons to glory. Jesus didn't come to bring slaves home. Jesus come to bring sons home. You want to come in good and faithful servant, you're 2,000 years on the wrong side of the resurrection. You're not coming in because you've learned how to obey God. You're coming in because you've learned what God looks like in the man Christ Jesus and begin to allow a relationship to cultivate.